Hey there, welcome back to Business as Unusual. In today's episode, we're diving into the world of creativity, self-care, and LGBTQ plus representation with the incredibly inspiring River Kai. Stick around as we explore how River finds inspiration, the power of storytelling, and River's journey from webcomics to romance novels. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one.
Business as Unusual is a thought-provoking podcast that explores the innovative strategies, disruptive ideas, and unconventional practices driving successful leaders and companies in the ever-evolving world of modern business. Subscribe, comment, and share for weekly inspiration with our host, Aicila.
Welcome to Business as Unusual. I'm here again with River Kai. Only this time we're going to talk about their work specifically. Welcome to the show, River.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be back.
Yeah, I'm excited. River did so much work around the episode we did with Authors for Palestine. It was nice to connect.
I appreciate you as well and your support. So I started out as a webcomic author, and I now make romance books and I still draw comics. I am an LGBTQ plus author and artist. I do all of my own illustrations and writing. More recently, I have an editor now that I work with, so that's a relief, but everything else is all me. And I love to write about survivors of difficult situations who are now finding true love for the first time. So that's the main theme that carries throughout all of my stories, but I love to write in multiple different genres. They usually have a romance plot line, but I write in sci-fi, fantasy, thriller, and some contemporary romance. And most of the time they have LGBTQ plus characters because I'm a trans guy and I'm also pansexual. So I love to have that representation of bisexual characters or pansexual, and then also people who are genderqueer somehow. So that's really fun for me. And that's what I love to write about.
Something you said that I appreciate is it's that what you said you like to have LGBTQ plus characters. And I'm jumping to the assumption that means that the point of their whole story isn't necessarily that they're LGBTQ plus. They just happen to exist in the world and that's how they are. You're nodding. So I just feel like that's such an important evolution of how we tell stories that are queer inclusive, because most of us don't go around saying, my whole life is defined by this one identity, whatever it is. And so to have people who are just there being themselves and that happens to be part of it feels important to me.
Oh, I'm with you on that. I definitely felt that way because my very first comic, it wasn't like overtly queer focused, I would say. But then my second webcomic was, and people really got into that one, but that was like almost 10 years now exactly ago. So that is a different time. It's crazy how much it has changed since then. But at that time, I feel like that's what people needed. And then once I got through that comic a bit more, I was like, I don't want this to be the sole focus, because I feel like all these characters have their own interests and lives that don't just relate to that. Like, of course, there are still important stories to tell, and I still think we need them, of like coming out stories, or like in that story, it's called What Sexual. The main character is trans and he's coming out to himself, but then his love interest is pansexual. So that's where the what sexual comes from, because that's what people would respond like at the time. But I wanted to have that representation in stories that I was reading. It was a little bit difficult to find at the time, so I was excited to be able to create something like that myself.
I feel that. And I do appreciate you stating too, like I do think a lot of the stories are important to tell, and how someone comes to accept and understand who they are and how they relate to the world is always, I think, going to be a very interesting story. I also appreciate that there's been some expansion. So I appreciate the reframing there because I don't want to in any way diminish that, that there are times
Oh, yeah.
where that for me also, like I remember Tanya Huff and Terry Moore both, I was like, oh wow, I didn't know this was a possibility. So that there's definitely the ways
Hmm.
books can invite you into understanding something about yourself that's new.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So how do you define success?
Oh, I feel like that's kind of challenging for me because sometimes I like worry about that, but I do feel like um, for me, my main goal is just to support others in feeling less alone in their experiences. So if I can write something that a reader is going to pick up and feel heard somehow, then I have succeeded. So I guess like even if there's just one reader who feels that way, I already feel like that is a success to me because that's someone outside myself who has had their perspective changed in some way, but not necessarily like I want to change their opinions, but more of like I would hope that they'd feel less alone because, especially when I'm writing about topics that have to do with mental health, often a lot of times people feel very isolated. I love to also write about characters with disabilities. I forgot to mention that, but I am also I have multiple chronic illnesses and multiple mental health conditions. So I know how isolating it can be, and oftentimes how much that can exacerbate some less favorable symptoms. So just by providing like, hey, you're not alone in this world. There's like here's a representation of a character that has the same experience, and that can show people, even though it's fictional, that they are not isolated from the rest of the world as much as it might feel. So to me that's like a dream for me. So
I love that. I appreciate that. So many of us are chasing belonging, as a colleague of mine said. And especially when we come to understand parts of who we are that are not necessarily as visible or affirmed in the mainstream culture, those pockets of like, oh, okay, can really mean a difference between a deep sense of isolation and some feeling of, oh, okay, there are places I can find if I'm capable to continue to look. So that sounds really beautiful to me.
oh yeah,
I
that's beautifully said as well.
Thanks. So I know that writing a book is not a small endeavor. What is it that prompted you to take that action to be a LGBTQ plus storyteller around disability? Because there are other people who have your identity and they haven't done that. So there was something in you that took that instinct into action. And that's a very interesting story for me and for I think the people that listen.
Yeah, so this is kind of like a maybe deeper story than some might expect because I do love reading and writing. So that helps, of course. But the real reason why I got started was that I really was truly on my deathbed at one point in my life. When I was very young, I was like only 18, where I made this decision to start storytelling, and it was a life saving decision because I was suffering so much that I was like, I don't even know how I'm going to survive. Like, my body had symptoms. I had severe chronic Lyme disease, and I had undergone multiple treatments, some experimental ones as well, that just further damaged me. So I was on oxygen, I was bedridden, and like pretty much no contact with people. I stopped talking because I was so shut down. And the only outlet I had was that I really loved the Tokyo Ghoul manga series. And it inspired me so much because the characters in that book are undergoing some really severe trauma, which sounds like that's not inspiring. But okay, to me, in that moment when I was in this very dark place, I was like, is kind of like what I was talking about, where it feels like, oh, this is like giving me like I feel heard. So I was like, what if I could do that for other people? So I started writing this story. It was called Chronic Nightmare Syndrome at the time, and I could really relate to it. And that was like 10 years ago, like a little over 10 years ago now. So it's kind of interesting how it's all coming back around because I didn't know how severe of PTSD I had or OCD and all these things that I've now been diagnosed with and have been working on treating. So to look back on that is really interesting because it was a tool for me to express what was going on despite me silencing myself due to trauma. And that was truly a magical experience because every day I would wake up in the morning and be like, okay, I'm working on this comic now. That's all I have to live for. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
to be frank, because other than that, I was like, and it's like I have a very high pain tolerance, and a lot of people have said I'm kind of like a not like stoic, but like I can get through things that are difficult. So for
Hmm.
me to be at that level, it had to be so severe that it was within the last inches of my life, and like people around me could feel that. So just by suddenly having this purpose, I was able to refocus my body in a way to keep pushing through. Because if I didn't finish the story and put out the next page day after day, then all the people reading wouldn't have something else to read. They wouldn't know how the story ended.
Right.
So, so that was what first inspired me, and I feel like I've come full circle because that story I discontinued it. Then I started writing it as a novel because it was originally a web comic. And then I rewrote it, wrote it again, started writing other books, and came back to it. But now I'm going to be finally publishing it this October.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
exciting.
so yeah, and it's undergone a whole journey. I feel like alongside me, where the characters have completely changed. I because I rewrote them, but this universe has expanded into this wild thriller that has like a deeply emotional side to it. So I feel like it really encompasses what my original intention was and what my intentions now have grown into. So I'm very excited about it, but that was it's interesting that that's like also where I started, and now I'm getting to continue working on it in a new way now.
Yeah, that is really neat. And I feel like there's some like wisdom sometimes in our experiences where we start somewhere and we don't necessarily understand how that is kind of a like a larger theme almost. Like there's seeing the path and there's walking the path, or I should say seeing the path
Hmm.
and going on the path because we don't always walk, right? That's I feel like that's a kind of wisdom that's good to remember that it's okay to go back to an idea or a place and see what's still there for you. And sometimes it can open you up pretty deeply.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that now that I have done more treatment for OCD and PTSD in particular, I can see how I was doing exposure therapy for myself through writing in a way
Hmm.
of like cycling over these topics that needed to come out of my system, but in a way that it was like separated from myself so that I was able to work on it because they're not my stories, they're these character stories, but I can relate to them. So it was like a way for me to work through those things at the level that I would that felt safe, because that's what really prevents a lot of people from accessing treatment a lot of times, other than of course like financial reasons and like difficulty like from the care like not being very accessible. But I just felt like it was also hard for me to want to face those things and be ready to face those things. So by writing about topics that were difficult for me to acknowledge or discuss, it opened me up to further healing later.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I think even sometimes just reading the story can do that. So imagine writing it would give you a different access even as well. You've already answered this a little bit, and I don't know if you want to say anything more explicit. As noted, I call my podcast business as unusual. In some ways, I feel like every story, every authorship is unique. And I'm also curious if you have any other specific thoughts on how you would define what makes this unusual.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty unusual to a lot of people when they hear I do my own covers and in artwork and writing, and then I also like there's a lot of people out there who self-publish, but I think due to my like original work being a webcomic, there webcomic artists are absolutely like unbelievable. And so I think I unintentionally internalized extremely unrealistic standards, but it caused me to be able to create like a lot of content in a very short amount of time because it just through pure practice. And that I think really changed things. So I can draw much faster due to that because I had no choice. If you want to keep up, you have to like cut corners and draw quickly and learn how to rework your creative process to churn things out. And so I feel like that is very unusual. And then also just the fact that I am trying to do as much of it as I can on my own. But I don't know. I have fun with it. So to me, it's like a benefit. Like,
That's awesome. Well, are you familiar with Gishwis, the greatest international scavenger hunt the world has ever seen?
no.
Okay, well, so I used to do that with my friends, and I similarly, it's 1 week and there's so many challenges, it's off the hook. And one of the things that I chose, and when you choose a challenge, like you have a week, right? So if you choose it and you take it off the list, you say you're going to do it, you have to do it. And I would realize like, oh, I can't sit and be distracted or perfectionistic or anything. I just have to dive in and get this done. And that was a really great lesson for me every year when I would do it. I would have to sort of ignore all of the things that said, I can't do this and this won't be good, and just go for it. And then sometimes I couldn't do it, it wasn't good. But more often than not, it was way better than I expected it to be just by getting into it. And so I'm hearing a little of that, like the webcomic world. And that's all year. I just did it for 1 week. So hats off to you, 100%. but
Oh,
but I
thank you.
remember that feeling of, oh wow, I surprised myself with what I just accomplished here by not deciding I couldn't accomplish it, I guess, or whatever that
Yeah,
is.
oh my gosh. Yeah, no, that's so true. I do feel like it unlocked like an internal philosophy for me to start letting go of perfectionism, particularly in terms of OCD. Like I know that's a stereotype, but like a lot of people have that still. But it's in ways where people don't expect. It'd be like, is this perfectly like unproblematic? It's not going to offend anybody in the world. Things that would be very unrealistic and very limiting. I still strive to, of course, not cause any harm,
Right.
but to the point where it would be like, I what if people don't like wearing the color red or something? That's unrealistic too. I think that having it be like, okay, you just got to get this done. Like if it's not perfect, oh well, it's got to go out there. People are going to look at it and scroll by it in half a second. And so even though I spend an hour on this one panel or something, which is a relatively short time as it is, yeah, I think it really pushed me to, like I said, in other ways to keep opening me up to more healing and more of getting out of those cycles that weren't serving me.
Yeah. Are your comics, are your web comics still up? Can people still go look at them?
Yeah, yeah. So my one of my first webcomics, Wet Sexual, that one is still up. It's completely finished, and that one is more about a trans guy who's coming into himself for the first time in college, but then it's due to, in part, someone coming in to save his life in the restroom when he's having a huge mental health crisis. And they go on to become close friends. So that's their story and
Okay.
how they have helped each other heal. Then I also have Resonance, which I have right here. I turned it into a
Here,
printed
wait, I'm gonna
comic
take a
as
screenshot
well.
here. Say again.
Okay. So I turned this into a printed comic as well. This is just volume one, and I'm still working on it. But yeah, so it has like full color illustrations, and I call them my space gays. Cute. So these are my space gays. This is Theo, he's a trans guy, and then this is Hayato, he's bisexual. So they have their own journeys. They have a taboo secret love for each other, which is not allowed in the industry. For I feel like, I mean, it kind of makes sense, but also it became unrealistic in certain real life circumstances. And I also, since I am anti colonization, wanted to have a comic where these characters are assigned to colonize Mars and be like, hey, even though that's not Earth, maybe that's not a good idea. So they are in for a tough journey in that aspect, but I have a lot of fun with that one.
That's awesome. Thank you. Like
Yeah, thank you.
I, as you know, I know Lillian Senzi, and one of the things that she and I have talked about over the years is the ways in which it can be a very interesting mental exercise to imagine what would it be like to create a world in which people are questioning colonization with, or even don't assume. Her work doesn't include militarization or police. She has a different
Mm,
belief around that. And
mhm,
so, in terms of being anti-colonizing and the story you're telling, are there ways that you found it to be freeing, or there are times when you go back and you're like, oh, I see how I had an unconscious way of, that's something that happens for me where I'm like, I think I've kind of unrooted it, and then I'm like, oh no, right, that's right there. I was just curious if you have
mhm.
any more thoughts on that or things to share about it.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of challenging to write characters who haven't really thought that through despite what they're doing. But for me, I feel like through the research before I started publishing the comic in any form was what frankly disturbed me on the plans that are in place, including things like potentially drilling on the moon to use it as fuel to make it like, because the problem they're trying to solve is like getting off the planet is a lot of takes up a lot of fuel, but then traveling all the way that long distance, it needs even more. And in order to do that, like the fuel's heavy, like there's just, it's always so complicated of a problem to solve. So they wanted to set up basically like gas stations in space. That's a very like plain way to say it, but I did not like that. I was like, the moon, part of why people find it so magical is that its surface stays perfectly untouched, and just the fact that they not only wanted to like go and mess with it further and introduce our ecosystem in a place where we don't know what we're damaging. We don't really understand what's there,
Yeah.
the level that, because we don't understand some of those things ourselves yet, like on our own planet. So
Hmm.
like just to be spreading that other places, I didn't like how they would basically be using humans as an experimentation and knowing that it's going to be extremely traumatizing for them. And like as someone who's chronically ill, this is their grand solution to like destroying the earth, like
Hmm.
because no one can go to space unless they're like it's almost impossible to become an astronaut because of the requirements and like physical health requirements. I so all of it to me just got more and more offensive in a way.
Hmm.
So I was like, you know what? I would love to take characters on that journey as well, where they're really realizing, like, oh no, I'm causing harm potentially.
Hmm.
but the way that they discover that is not what you would expect. So I'm excited to start showing that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'll leave a little teaser there. That's good. And
Yeah.
so, is there advice that you've received that you can share that's influenced the way you approach your work?
Oh gosh, I have to think about this one for a second. Because I feel like I've received so many, like a lot of great advice. I have to think, because I just know that my dad is an artist, so I grew up learning from him about. I feel like skipping over some of the unhelpful mindsets that some artists get stuck in. I definitely think that he helped me realize that everything is just a work in progress. And when I would feel very self critical, I would think of things that he had said to me about how you want to keep growing as you create. So, my first webcomic that inspired my upcoming novel, it like to be honest, it's so embarrassing, like to look at it. But that was where I was at as an artist at the time, and you can watch. I improved with every page, and that's amazing. And that I feel like gives other artists hope. And I could have gone back and deleted that and hit it, and been like, I need to redo this. But my dad was like, no, just keep going. Like, just
Mhm.
this is where you're at and you're inspiring people that they can improve as well. And I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. So it really changed my mindset from the beginning of like, it's okay if this doesn't look perfect and I know it doesn't and I would like to be better, but I can
Yeah.
use that to push myself to be better rather than trying to hide something that happened. Like I wasn't perfect at drawing and I that's okay. Like everybody has to learn. So I think
Mhm.
that is probably one of my favorite lessons I've learned through this
Yeah,
experience.
I definitely second that. I look back and every 6 months, I'm like, I want everybody who's on my podcast to come back because it's so much better now. And and then I'm like, you
Yeah.
know what? That's actually great. I love that I'm improving. And sometimes people do come back. And part of it is because I've improved it and changed it, I can have people that were on and I can give a different understanding of what they're up to or share a different aspect of it. So it's not bad, but I definitely have that. There's someone I listened to who said, if you look back 10 years ago and you're not cringing at something, then you probably aren't growing enough. And I kind
Yeah.
of like that attitude. Like, okay, like, yeah, I've evolved. This isn't a bad thing. Hopefully, in 10 years, I'll be cringing about something that happened this year because I'm continuing to learn and evolve and grow. Will you talk
I love
about
that.
something you do or have done to keep yourself inspired?
Oh yeah. I think that of course looking at other people's creative works is a major inspiration as well as listening to the world. I know that I mentioned that in our last podcast is very relevant with some of the horrible things going on, not only in Palestine, but all across the world. So I find that listening is very important before writing because it tells me what I feel like people might need stories to like to help us all collectively in a way to continue to grow and heal and within ourselves because I do feel like we all are connected and that the more we can support each other the more we can continue to grow in ways that we're hoping for and improve everybody's quality of life. So I try to look for things that I can relate to that I think I can accurately and talk about and give proper care to because that's very important to me. Other people do inspire me a lot in many different ways. Um, and just enjoying my time because it's very hard for me sometimes to take a step back and rest, especially when I feel like I gotta keep creating and keep pushing stuff out because it's all me. I'm doing it all. But it is very important to rest. And in a very silly way, I love to play like The Sims, which is like,
Nice.
and that is one of my main sources of inspiration because I will write absolute trash with the game, and then I feel like, oh, there, it's out of the way. And
You did it.
then,
It's done. It's an
but then,
aperitif.
yeah. But then sometimes the trash inspires me. It's like I feel like, hey, wait, this kind of got deep all of a sudden. Like I'm gonna put some of these concepts in. So it's funny what you can draw inspiration from, but I do feel like the main aspect of it is like fun.
Yeah. Playful. I was reading something I don't know enough yet to know if it's true. So I'll say it here with the caveat of don't take this as fact. Go check it out. But that playfulness, which feels really true
Oh
to
yeah.
me. But I haven't done anything to look into it other than my own experience. So,
Yeah, no, I can relate to that, especially because OCD, a lot of people do exposure therapy, and same, you can OCD, a lot of people do exposure therapy, but I work really well with it because it's my treatment. So within that, I find it very healing to find the humor in some of what's happening, especially with OCD exposure because you chose as my treatment. So I have a knife with me, like just
mhm,
because there's so many possibilities of danger, like that your brain will cycle over.
mhm,
But like with no proof of anything like that ever happening, but still, that's just like the nature of it. But it's just things like that that suddenly can be like, okay, this is kind of silly, and I have found that that's like a sign of like, wait, okay, where things are shifting now. Like I
mhm.
feel like I can get past some of these fears because I do see some humor in it, or I do feel like that lighthearted energy. Like it feels really refreshing.
Um, that's neat. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So I know you're doing an event this weekend, and then so if you could share a little about that, and then also in general for folks that are listening, how do they learn more, follow you, get in touch, etc.
Yeah, so I am super excited about this. This event that is happening this weekend. I did not expect would happen for like at least a year. So I
Ah,
happened to meet an author in Washington, Tori Fields, who is super, super sweet. I met her at another book signing event at the Romance Era Bookshop in Vancouver, which is one of my favorite places ever. Definitely visit their shop. And they just moved. It's beautiful. But Tori invited me to do a group romance author book signing at Barnes and Noble in Kirkland, Washington, which was like a dream for me. So I'm so excited. And so that's this weekend, Saturday, August 24th. It's from 12 to 4 p.m. And we're going to be doing a number of panels on top of the signing. So we're kind of like trading in and out. Some of us are talking about microtropes and romance, and I'm doing two different panels. So one of them is sex positivity in romance, which I want to bring like an LGBTQ plus and specifically trans lens to that because I think that's very important. And I'm also doing another one about LGBTQ plus topics in romance. And so the other authors who will be joining me are Tori Fields, I had mentioned, who invited us, and then Molly Machado, Christina Braver, and Kelly Reynolds. So the five of us will be there, and I'm super excited about it. It's called A Celebration of Romance, and it's in Kirkland, Washington. I
nice.
think I said that wrong, just in
It's
case.
okay. Yeah, and it always people can't remember where their car keys are. You got to say things multiple times.
Yeah.
And and so in general, follow you on Instagram. Is that do you have a website, email list, something like that that they can join, or what are
Yeah.
other good ways for folks to stay connected, get in touch, etc.
riverkaiart.com, and that usually has a lot of different updates. I'll try to on my event page have events listed that I so if I'm going to a book signing, even if it's free to go to, you can RSVP on there and it'll my website will send an automatic reminder before the event. I also have a newsletter that I send out monthly with the exception of if I'm having a book release. So I will try to only email max, and that would just be like once for the regular newsletter where I update everybody, and then once for like, hey, here's a new book. So that is at riverkiteart.com/newsletter.
Nice.
And yeah, that's, I think all of my links should be on there. So,
Lovely. Well, you should check. I actually have one of your books from the Authors for Palestine, and it's on
oh,
my list of things to read because we got a little excerpt of it on the show. So go check out that show. I'll put the link in the notes for folks if you missed it. And let me just say, there's werewolves. How do you can't go wrong with werewolves.
that's so sweet of you to grab it. Thank you.
So, and thanks everybody. Is there anything else you want to get out there today, or?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I really appreciate how much you support the community of small businesses and like unusual businesses. I think
Mhm,
that's so fun. I love to like include my readers and people who like my artwork as like my fellow weirdos. So I feel like this is very on
mhm.
par with what I love to be involved with. But I guess like any last thing I would like to say is that if anyone out there is struggling with something, you're not alone, and there is support out there for you. So please seek that out. You absolutely deserve it. And there is hope for things to change and improve, even if it's like bit by bit over time. And I can definitely attest to that as a person. So I'd love for people to keep going however they can and take care of themselves along the way.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that a lot. And thank you so much for
Yeah.
being here. I really love what you're up to. Seriously, follow River on Instagram. You will not be sad. And
Oh,
and thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.
thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoy the show. I love making it. If you did enjoy it, consider hopping over to the review portion of the platform you listen on and letting other people know about it. Or share the episode or the entire show with a friend or subscribe to the show. Definitely reach out, get on my newsletter, follow me on social media, and let me know what you like, what you don't like, and what you'd like to see in the future. Well, we love our guests. Appearance on the Business as Unusual podcast or any Bicurean consulting production is for information purposes only and is not to be considered an endorsement of their business practices, or character. Please properly vet anyone you find through this podcast and generally before you do any business with them. Thank you for listening.